I think we're live. Hi. Yes, we are
I
live
think
on Facebook.
I think we are live, brother.
Hey, Jason Mitchell.
Hey, John Jacob Mubarak. What's
It's so
going on
great to
with
be
you,
with
brother?
you. Well, I'm
Uh,
down here. Down here in Costa Rica, and I'm super excited to be with you, man, to have this opportunity to dive into conversation today regarding what's going on in our world, current events.
yeah, absolutely. I'm grateful to be able to be with you. I love the idea that you and I get a chance to have this conversation together. I'm excited for you and this platform and for what you're going to be doing with this platform.
I am too. I have to acknowledge my sister Jen Tadini, who uh, called me the other day and said, I got a great idea. And she told me about this. And I said, okay, yes. So I want to give acknowledgement and thanks to Jen for the idea of this. And thank you to you for being our first uh, guest on this evolving conversation of consciousness. So before we get too far in, you know, you're a practitioner and have always been a guiding light for me in your practice and kind of forging the way, leading the way,
Thank you,
and
brother.
absolutely, and and so bringing that practitioner consciousness, I'd love to ask you to open this conversation with an evocation, and maybe a
Absolutely.
brief explanation of what an evocation is.
Well, let's go to school. Why don't we? A lot of people will have a time in the beginning of something sacred or something that they're honoring, where they will take the time to welcome or call in the presence, right? And so we do evocations in our community because we know that the presence is always here, and so we invite our awareness of the presence in, and we extend it out into the awareness of whatever it is that we're engaged in. So, in our language, we do an evocation to evoke the spirit.
Beautiful. Yes.
So, why don't we just go ahead and do that now?
Let's do it.
So, we turn within, closing the outer eye just for a moment and opening our inner awareness. As Reverend Michael said yesterday, we open our first eye.
Yes.
And so, how grateful I am to have this opportunity to come together with this wonderful organization, Rythmia, with my dear brother, my roomie, John Jacob Mubarak, to be a part of this community and this conversation that is so very necessary. Knowing absolutely we are absolutely one with the living presence that is calling forth this moment, that is calling forth this occasion. And knowing that it is from that oneness with life itself, oneness with each other, oneness with the community that is gathered here, that we speak a declaration that everything that is being called forth into existence for this time of sacredness, this time of communication, this time of communion, this time of being, this time of being breathed through,
Yes.
is already happening now. We know that God's work is active in us. We yield to it and declare that it is having its way now. It is
Yes.
so, and so it is.
And so it is.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Ashe.
Mm, I love that. Knowing that God's work is active within us and having its way. We just
Absolutely.
allow it to be. So beautiful, man. So excited. So, you know, this, I've been so, I'm sure, like everyone, even down here, thousands of miles away from the United States, thousands of miles away from California, so affected by the activities of what's going on in our nation, in our communities. And, you know, Jason, I think aside, I mean, in addition to the deep years of devotion and spiritual work that you do and who you are in our community at Agape as I'd say the managing director of the Agape Practitioner Corps, and so many other ways in which you are of service at Agape, and the work that you've done internally and spiritually, your devotion. And you've used that. What I love about you and what I really want to bring forth is, can you tell us a little bit about your background, just so people understand the unique perspective that you bring. Your dad was the chief of police for LAUSD, which was like the second largest police force in the nation or something like that, you know?
Absolutely. So I come from somewhat of a law enforcement family. My father he worked his way up from being the security guard on campuses back in the 70s that used to wear suits on high school campuses to take care of the students, all the way up to becoming the chief of police for the Los Angeles Unified School District, which was the second largest school district in the nation at the time. I have an uncle who was a lieutenant in the sheriff's department, and I just found out yesterday that our mutual friend Clyde Terry knew him. So we had a good
Ah,
conversation about that. And aside from the law enforcement experience and aspect that I have, I worked for 8+ years down on Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles at the time, and I believe still we have the largest homeless population in the nation. Prior to that, I worked in education in LAUSD, and there's always been something about my life that's been able to be clear that the way that I'm called to be in the world is primarily of service. That there may be many things that I do, but there's always the through line of service in what I'm called to do.
absolutely. I see that. I know that for a fact because I know you. And I think that work that you've done, you know, on Skid Row, of being of service there, of understanding uh, that experience, as well as your involvement and connection with law enforcement, and your own personal experience with the visceral, percussive experiences of being an African American in the United States. You know, all of that, I would, you know, really want to bring to bear. And, you know, as we talked briefly earlier today about this conversation, there were some questions that came up, and one of the things that I think is so important about this moment is to understand that this isn't happening in a vacuum. It wasn't like something happened in Minneapolis and this exploded. And so I'd love to have you explain a little bit more about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I was on my morning run today, and I have been contemplating the events of the past week. And really, the analogy that came up for me was that we look at society in silos. We try to look at individual events, and we don't look at the backstory. We don't look at all of the threads that are connected. Many people are see are not aware of what happened to George. They don't know really what happened with the police officer. It's saturating our news feeds, but there are still people who are not aware of what specifically started what seems to be a lot going on. And in some people's mind, even what they see, the perspective that they take is one that all of this is starting with the events that happened to George Floyd. And that's not at all the case. So the analogy that came up for me was the events and everything that's happening. Our society is alive. It's a
Yeah.
living, breathing, interacting, connecting energy. You know, there's all sorts of energies ebbing and flowing. There are rising tides, there are falling tides, and all of this is what's actually happening in our society. And our society is very much like the human body. And racism and homophobia and sexism and misogyny, all of these things are like different viruses and sicknesses in the human body. And one of the things that we don't really notice a lot of times in the doingness of our lives and raising our children and pursuing our careers and chasing the bag and trying to make some money and trying to change our own lives is we don't see the things that are always going on. To that end, it's very much like the human body, whereas when you get a little cold, there's a little disruption in the system. There's a little feeling of a little achiness. And, you know, society's had lots of colds. And people have tried to put band-aids on the colds, but society has also been suffering from very serious viruses. And society itself is reacting in the same way that the body does when the body is attacked by a virus. And the virus in this case is racism. The virus has other forms and shapes that it takes, like the patriarchy. it has other sides that it takes, like homophobia and transphobia and fat phobia. There's all these different ways and sicknesses that our society maintains and does not do anything about. So to that end, we are not all always prepared for the way the body is going to respond to the things that we neglected. And so we have neglected in this country to deal with racism. We have neglected in this country to deal with police brutality. We have neglected to even acknowledge and recognize the origin of the policing forces in this nation that have their origin in the slave catchers that used to go and patrol and look for people. And so we don't realize, like even Los Angeles, we have had police forces that literally immigrated, transferred, brought people from the South who had this terrible relationship with racism in terms of their own racism to Los Angeles to actually be a part of the police force in Los Angeles. Parker Center in downtown Los Angeles is named after the former chief of police who recruited to Los Angeles's black communities these very brutal, racist individuals to join the police force to police the people of Los Angeles. And we have seen this same pattern happen in cities all around the world, where we as citizens were not regarded when we said, hey, there are problems with the police force. The number of meetings that people have had with the mayors and the city council people. And what you're having now is the virus has struck a certain chord that not just George Floyd's death, but also Sandra Bland and also Tamir Rice and also Tatiana and so many other voices that we hit a tipping point. And the virus just happens to be a great analogy because that's the exact same thing what we're dealing with in relationship to why we're all staying at home and why we're all struggling with not being able to live our lives in the way that we have. And it's essential for me that we see that this is something that's not new and that the way that it's expressing as marches and it's expressing as protests, but also how it's expressing is ways that you can't control, because when you had the opportunity and everything was peaceful to do something like the body, before, when you had opportunity to eat more plant-based, you had opportunity to move a little bit more, you had opportunity to do preventative exams, we weren't doing those things for our body. So we have a stroke, so we have a heart attack, so we faint. So society has not been addressing these issues. And so these issues are showing up as disruptive behavior in the city streets. It's showing up as protest march that are not designed for you to be able to control where people walk, but so that people can get your attention to say, hey, there's so much more going on here, and we're trying to get your attention around that. And then it's also showing up with other factors, mitigating factors in the body, high blood pressure, hypertension, all of these other things show up to take on the virus as well, because the virus is affecting everything. So then looters start jumping in. So then other things get involved in the protests, and so much more is happening than people are able to see, because they haven't been paying attention and they haven't been addressing the issues all along.
I love the analogy of the virus. And I was thinking as you were talking, I just want to make a note here so I don't forget to come back to the last point you made about the looters. But, you know, we talk a lot about asymptomatic expression, right? Like you have the virus, but you're not showing any symptoms.
Absolutely.
Right? That's a big part of our own internalized racism. Right?
Absolutely.
Like, I wouldn't walk around saying I'm a racist, but I have a lot of asymptomatic, unexamined assumptions, beliefs that I haven't even become aware of.
The woman in Central Park is a perfect expression of
Yes.
that. She sees herself as a liberal. She sees herself as contributing to the community. She sees herself as not racist. But in a moment, she showed up is exactly what it looks like to harbor racist views and to weaponize your whiteness and the police force against a person specifically because they're black.
And it is an outbreak, right? We're a carrier of this virus. It's not expressing itself in our everyday, right? And then this outbreak occurs. I got a big old cold sore on the lip of our society. You
Yes,
know?
absolutely.
And so this is an opportunity. We can look at this as an opportunity, a call to go within. And I want to talk later about some specific things that we can do. But I also think it's really important because in the conversations that I've had, in the texting that's going on with my friends and family, and the way that I'm hearing from different news sources, the way that the looting is described, there seems to be a sort of understanding from some news sources that there's peaceful protest and there's looting. And then from different news sources, it's just all the protesters and looters are, these violent protests. And so I'd love your, two things, your opinion, your insight on that, and also how can people who maybe don't have a connection to the visceral experience of this, right? Their lives haven't been affected by racism in the way, of course, it happens to one, it happens to all, but they haven't felt the need to put their hands on the dash when they get pulled over by a cop, right? They have a reasonable expectation they're going to get a ticket and sent away, not, as Dave Chappelle says, spread my cheeks.
Absolutely.
So how can you give us a little bit more of understanding of not a justification of the looting, but how can we understand this and a way to assimilate it into our awareness?
So two things. That we had initially started with the idea about the news, right? And so part of the conversation that everybody must understand that when they're watching the news is that the news is driven specifically broadcast news. So whether you're talking CNN, whether you're talking like any news source that is driven by a corporation is driven primarily by its profits. It's not driven by its quality of news, its quality of investigative reporting, its subject matter. It's not driven primarily by a mission to serve the community. So once you realize that, then you can look at everything that you're receiving in a different eye. You can look at the same things and see different things. You can notice the criticism or the narration that the anchor is having, or the Orange Street reporters, the questions they are asking and they're not asking, and the places where they are pointing their camera and the places where they're not pointing their camera. Because now that we have cameras everywhere, most of us are seeing the live action through the protest marches from the live news feeds of our different friends or associates or things that go viral and they repost. So that's the thing about the news. And as we begin to approach the idea of looting, understand that it's not that suddenly people lost their moral compass. It's not even that people are purely doing the looting because they need something. My observation of the looting, this is Jason's observation, is that this is the opportunity to rebel up against the system. Yeah. And that there is no greater representation of America's system than anything that looks like capitalism. And that's unfortunate. And I'll come back to why that's unfortunate, but that's what they see. So when they see Starbucks, all they think about is corporation, and that's a part of the symptom. They may not even be intellectual enough to articulate that, but it is a part of the things that we recognize. We see how we were just listening to all of the hundreds of millions of dollars that the government was able to find to give to businesses, and $1,200 to the citizens if you paid your taxes. Like you couldn't even get the stimulus dollars if you hadn't paid your recent taxes. And then they couldn't figure out how to do it fast enough, but they could figure out how to give it to large businesses, and large businesses that were not yet hurting, that were flush with cash. And so right. Citizens are in the middle of all of this trauma. Again, George Floyd's murder is not an isolated incident. It's not the only thing that caused all of the people to get into the streets. There are all of the events that have taken place for centuries at this point, where there was systemic oppression, where there was a system that we call capitalism that people love. But people also disregard that the system that people love, called capitalism, is vicious. It's destructive. It oppresses people, specifically because In order for profits for companies to keep going up, the individual salaries of everyday people cannot rise either. So you have to find a way to save money, and there's a whole thing that goes on there. Jerry and I have actually had some wonderful conversations about that and disagreements. But that's one of the reasons why I love Jerry, because we can disagree. And so when they're doing these marches and they're doing what they're doing, most people are trying to evoke the name of Tatiana, of Sandra, of Tamir, of all of these individuals. And then while the protest is going on, there's another agency that is active amongst the groups of people. And you're seeing it in the videos of people that are dressed in all black and taking hammers to auto zones, people who are dressed in all black that are taking their opportunity to destroy buildings and spray paint all over everything, but are not really, spray painting Black Lives Matter or BLM on the side of a Starbucks, but are not actually in the organization Black Lives Matter, that are not actually in or living in those communities. And there's a wrestling match between whether or not those people should do those things or whether or not people should stop them from doing those things. And the reality is, none of this is any individual's responsibility, and people are always trying to push it off on somebody else. All of this is all of us. And so the challenge then becomes, while people are protesting, while people are marching, yes, there are looters. Yes, there are agitators. Yes, there are provocateurs. And yes, all of this is a result. We've reached this fever pitch because America as a society has not addressed the specific virus of racism. We can look at the other things, but there's nothing as insidious, ingrained in the blood of the soil of America as racism. And you can no longer control. You're like a doctor and you're on the episode of House and you're trying to figure out why all of these things are being affected, because this person's body, because society is breaking down, because America has not addressed its issues around racism. It hasn't addressed the way that it was ingrained into the laws. So people can't even use the Constitution and hold up the Constitution as a document to defend the way racism has been in this country, because racism was written into the fiber of the Constitution of the United States. So until those things are addressed, you can't even begin to criticize and complain and get too upset. You have your right to your upset, but in consciousness, if we're not dealing with the thing that's coming up, you can expect it to show up in the body. If you're not dealing with your own anger, then you wonder why you have hypertension. If you're not dealing with your own anger, you're wondering why you're stressed. All of these things are symptoms of the systemic racism, and you cannot be fixated on the symptom and only make it seem like the symptom is the thing that you wanted to address. Everything would be fine if they weren't breaking windows and destroying and looting. If we had addressed racism in the 60s, following the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and these individuals who had been doing everything they could to do things peacefully, we wouldn't be here today.
I hear what you're saying, and I do find myself wishing for that Martin Luther King Jr. consciousness right now. I find myself wishing there was a national leader who stepped up, because I see the violence begetting violence, right? This is, I mean, I don't see a justification. I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and speak from my heart in this. I see the so much anger and this history and this insidious, ingrained racism that you're talking about, and I can also see, in my history, the history of the Middle East, right? My people. There's not anyone on either side of the Palestinian-Israeli conversation that has not been hurt. Not every single one of them have a justification for violence.
Absolutely.
Right? And so obviously that's not going to progress us beyond. And so I want to turn, in a few minutes that we have left, and know we're going to go over time, but you had such a beautiful, you know, the aftermath. We talked about the aftermath,
Mm-hmm.
and what are some real actions that we can take now in terms of how do we as spiritual individuals who are looking to find our healing in consciousness, because we must be at peace in ourselves before we can see peace in the world. What are some things that we can say to our listeners that are real actions we can take in the midst of what's going on, so we're not just wringing our hands and going, oh, it's hopeless, or that's awful, or those people shouldn't do that?
Absolutely. So two things. One, my expression was not a defense as much as an explanation, because most people just really can't make the connections.
Right.
So I'm not here to defend it, because I don't think it needs to be defended. But when we're talking about the world that we live in, the primary thing that the average person, and maybe our audience is not necessarily the average person, but the average person has absolutely no interest in self-awareness. They have no idea, they have no interest in why they think the way they think. They have no interest in why they process information the way they process information. They have no interest in consciousness. Our society is not raising citizens to become conscious. Our society uses the word consciousness and being awake in ways that are not about consciousness, not about source, not about our awareness of our own awareness. And so the first thing for any of us that are going through it, when we're ready, because we have to be ready, the first thing that any of us should do to solve the issues of the world and racism and all this stuff that's going on is to address our own consciousness. We have to come to an awareness of our
Yes.
own thoughts, of our own mind. We have to be willing to do the inner work, because too often people are running out into the world and they're doing all of these things because they have high intentions, but the impact can also be problematic. You
Mm-hmm.
know, people are to insert the Catholic missionaries trying to save the Africans from a life that they were very happy with. So, you know, people are out there trying to live a life of and they're not interested in consciousness. So the first thing that we must do is we must become aware of our own consciousness. When
Yes.
we become aware of our own consciousness, we get to see our own blind spots. All of us, every single human being has a blind spot. Somewhere back here, there's a curtain. I can only see that because I've got a camera pointing back at me. But through my day to day, I see my peripheral, but I don't see what's happening behind me. I don't see the areas that I'm not looking at. So if I'm not looking at my perception of black people, of gay people, if I'm not looking at my perception of police officers and the sheriff deputies, if I'm not looking at my perception first, and included in my perception, my wounds can be revealed. My own trauma can be revealed. And so I can begin doing the healing and the traumatic work around my own self. But if that's not my thing, if I'm not dealing with the healing, if I don't have areas like that over here, I can deal with my relationship with people that are African American, that are Mexican American, that are Libyan American, that are other different groups and peoples. And I can begin to observe what's the programming that I'm running when I see these people. When they walk down the street, why am I clutching my purse? When I step into the elevator, am I stepping aside because I have a problem or a concern, or am I, you know, there's work that gets done in consciousness, and then as you become aware of your own consciousness, then you can do the work. Then you can step out and say, hey, how can I, when I'm walking through my day to day, address this? The conversations that I have with friends, the way that I should speak up when I hear people using language and having conversations about things that are all obviously of a racist and seeking to activate racist opinions and ideas. Then I can begin showing up in the world differently. And one of the things that I talked to you about earlier was, is my entire circle homogenous? Am I
Yes.
only around people who look like me? And it's not the I have a black friend thing. And one of the
One of my
jokes used
best
to
friends
be,
is gay.
"Oh yeah, I dated a black woman." That's not news, pal. Black women date people. Welcome to the world. But do you have intimate relationships with people who are not like you? And while we're talking about race, but that goes for everything. But in terms of race, you know, are there Black people who have you in their home? Are you intimately connected with Black people? Because we just don't invite everybody over to our house. It's just
And
true.
even more on that, you know, in terms of our circle of friends, but because we are so constrained by the algorithms of our social media, you know, I get fed what I like. So am I going over to the other news stations? Am I looking actively at what else is being said outside of my information bubble?
Do I see the information that the other groups who seem to see me as other, do I see how they're a victim to their own bubble? They're a victim to the continued recycled lies and ideations that they don't even recognize because they don't even know it's racist. If the National Security Advisor for the United States of America can come on TV and say that there's no systemic racism in the armed forces of the United States, after there's already been a report that has said there's documented racism in the Air Force and you know they didn't do every branch, then you're just being willfully ignorant. And so you know that there's an agenda behind that. And so then we stop pretending like these things aren't actually happening. So then when we are in conversations with people, we challenge those limited ideas.
And I think also, you know, because I know that the folks that are tuning into this, you know, through the Rythmia channel, through the Agape channel, that these individuals have declared a life of desire to become more aware of expansion in consciousness. And so, you know, I felt so keenly the call when all this was going on. I could feel two things within me. One, an old compulsive behavior to numb out, however that looks, right? Numb myself out, just, right? Exactly. And then there was the call to prayer. There was the call to meditate, to go into consciousness. Like I'm in Costa Rica. I don't even know if I would go out to the march based on what's happening if I were there, but I'd have a different thought about it if I were there. But down here, I really can't physically do anything in terms of protest or marching peacefully. But I can go into consciousness, that inward journey, because you know the principle as within, so without. We can't have peace in our neighborhoods, in our homes, in our nation, if we're not at peace within ourselves.
Absolutely. The last two things we had talked about covering is first, it's an inside job, right?
Yes.
It's all an inside job. Even the idea of America comes from an inner idea, an inner impulse, they say, for freedom, right? But the second thing is a teaching that Reverend Michael ingrained in me in my early years at Agape, which was simply this: choice is a product of awareness. You
Yes.
cannot make choices about things that you're not aware of. So all of the different places you have blind spots, and in some cases people have on blinders, and in some cases they're so myopic they cannot even perceive that there's another world, another idea, another experience other than the one they know, and that they live in a region, in a country, or parts of the country where there's almost no people that are not like them. And so they only have the recycled ideas from the people who are like them. And so they only get their information about us and other people other than them through the media. And that's all manipulated. And so the idea that once we have an awakening, a bit of awareness, just a little bit of awareness, then we're actually choosing. Until we have awareness, we're running somebody else's programming.
And that movement to awareness, the expansion of our awareness, as you said, I think comes in. So just to leave people with a little actual things that they can do is one, expanding our circle physically with our interactions with people, as well as our information circles, and then that inward journey through meditation, through prayer. I know Agape has meditation and prayer and community gatherings at agapelive.com. They're doing wonderful, wonderful gatherings. We have at Rythmia, we have our daily Facebook Lives. as well. And so and many other platforms, right? Many other places you
Absolutely.
can look to see ways to expand, ways to dip into community through communities of prayer and meditation. So with that said, there's so much more. We could talk for hours. Just
They should know that you're going to be doing these on a regular basis, so
yes,
they need to add this to their agenda so they can tune in, brother.
that's right. We're now doing this every Monday. Every Monday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, we'll do conversations of conscious conversations, and I'm so grateful, Jason, to have this time with you. I so appreciate your unique perspective, and I just want to ask you to close us out with a brief prayer.
Oh, absolutely. It'd be my joy, and it's my honor to be here with you for your first expression of this platform. So I love it, and thank you, Jerry, and all the people at Rythmia. I
Yes.
just much love for all the great work that's being done there. Let's turn within for just a moment, everyone.
Yes.
Closing the outer eye for a moment. I invite you to take a breath with me. And in that breath, I invite you to remember that we were all being breathed by the same. So grateful that there is one power, one presence. So grateful that there is a community, that there are many communities of individuals gathered, that there are many different cultures and pathways that are represented here. So grateful for that. So grateful for that living presence, that love intelligence, that which is God, that which is Allah, that which is Jehovah, that which is Great Spirit, that which is the all in all, the I in I.
Yes.
To know that that presence is my life. It is John Jacob's life. It is the life of each and every one in this field. It is the one life, and I know that we are united in the conscious awareness of this reality. So I speak a blessing over our time together, knowing that everything that has been articulated, every idea, even those who are communicating in the chat, everything that has been brought up is brought up in such a way that we have the skills, the tools, the gifts, the inner awareness on how to navigate it. I'm knowing that the different places and spaces where we have our blind spots, that our blinders are removed and dissolved and cast
Yes.
into the sea of nothingness. I'm
Yes.
knowing that the places and spaces where we may have hardened, in the places and spaces where we may not want to look, that the darkened places, that our wounds, all of the things that are up, healing is being activated even now. Transformation is taking place even now.
Yes.
The idea of an other is being dissolved, and our recognition of our oneness, that the recognition of that violation of any idea, if it's happening to anyone, if it's happening to anyone, anywhere, it is happening to me. And
Yes.
I embrace that idea in such a way that I have never, ever again linked to separation, linked to otherness. I am the evolutionary impulse made manifest. We are the evolutionary impulse made manifest. We can manage and navigate through the difficult, through the challenge, through the ugly, through the sensational, and we can do it as the light of the living presence, maintaining the consciousness, the love, the joy, the beauty that we are, as we birth a world that works for everyone.
Yes.
It is so now, and we allow it to be. And so it is. Amen.
And so it is. Amen.
Ashe.
Ashe. Aho.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. That's what I love about you, brother. What a prayer. What a prayer.
Thank you, man. Thank you, brother.
God bless you, Jay. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next Monday, 1 o'clock Pacific time.
Peace and
much
blessings.
love.